Hedgehog here. Now, one of the features of most role-playing games is the idea that the character can attempt any action or anything that whatever his character represents could reasonably try. He can try. He's not forced. The player's not forced to pick between a predetermined list of moves or actions. Now we can trace this philosophy back to the old Kriegsspiel games, which are Kriegsspiel is just German for war game. Which these games were made for the military to train officers, and the way they worked is the officer would write down the orders to his virtual troops and submit them to the referee, who would take all the orders from all the players, mix them up, move some pieces on the map, and then report back the results of the actions. In his book, Heinz Guderian talks about wargaming the invasion of France. And 2 days after the invasion of France, he says this. He says, "In view of the very short time at our disposal, we were forced to take the orders used in the war games from our files, and after changing the dates and times, issue these as orders for the attack. They were perfectly fitted to the reality of the situation." So this freedom of action was devised for realism's sake. Because you're training officers, you want it to be as realistic as possible. There's an American version of these Kriegsspiel games called Strategos, where in the Strategos he talks about this, about adapting the rules and applying the referee's kind of personal experience to adjudicate actions, and how the rules must adapt to the situation. Now again, these games are being run by military men, so hopefully the people running the game have enough experience to be able to adjudicate quickly any sort of strange thing that would come up. But this philosophy of letting the players kind of expand the game by their actions was picked up by a guy named Dave Wesley, who was working on the Strategos games, and he and Dave Arneson made a kind of a simplified version that Dave Arneson used to run his Napoleonics games. They call it Strategos N. I don't have a copy of that, so I don't know exactly what's in there. But Dave Wesley took this idea to heart about, you know, letting the players try anything, and he applied it in one of his convention games called the Braunstein games. And in these Braunstein games, which were multiplayer miniature games, like 10 or 15 players, instead of what was normally done at the time and splitting the players into two groups and having them fight each other, he gave every player his own character. Every player had his own character, his own victory conditions, and his own resources, whether that's troops or access to the map or money or whatever that character would have in that situation. And in these Braunstein games, there was a they were in a village, and there were some French troops arriving, and all the players had different things that they wanted to get done before the invasion or during the invasion to try and achieve their own personal victory conditions. Now these weren't exclusive, so you could have multiple people winning. So everyone was really working for themselves and working, trying to get whatever they could do to win themselves, whether it's playing their character and trying to manipulate the situation to their advantage. Now, this freedom of action, even though it was really popular with the players, they loved being able to, role play and doing all sorts of crazy things, but it came at a very high price, and that price was time. These games were really slow. In the very first time that he ran the Braunstein games, the French troops never got there, and usually he would run, and maybe he'd run it again, and like 4 or 5 turns would go by, and these military games would take days to resolve. And that's just the price you paid for having a bunch of characters running around doing a bunch of crazy things and having this freedom of action. Dave Arneson was a fan of these games, and he went back to his own group and started running his own fantasy one called Blackmore, a Wild West one called Brownstone. But at some point, late 1970, early 1971, after a marathon, session of old horror movies and old crappy science fiction movies, like you see on a Saturday afternoon. Anybody who grew up before cable knows what I'm talking about. He decided to send the players through the dungeons beneath the castle of Blackmore. And there's a description of this first dungeon delve in Fight on Number 2, I think. Yeah, Fight on Number 2, by one of the participants. I'll talk about this more in another video. But the important thing is the physical confines of the dungeon, the walls, the hallways, the doors, the stairs. What they did is they limited the players' choices. So even though the players had freedom of action, their choices were limited. Turn left, turn right, open the door, don't open the door. What this meant was that this limited action combined with the sort of the smaller play area of the dungeon, because you just got the however many rooms there are, meant that for the first time, you could run these freedom of action games quickly. There was no real delay between the time the player attempts an action and the time the game master replies about the action. So, you know, if you know, maybe he'll make a die roll or two, but the results of those actions are immediate. And what this meant was that gameplay took on more of a conversational style. So this conversational gameplay. I say something, the game master comes back to me, and we're talking back and forth more so than describing our actions and waiting and then getting the result. We're talking even in what this meant was that even small minor actions could be resolved so quickly that they weren't slowing the game down. So I can wiggle the doorknob, I can, you know, open the chest and look inside of it, or look at the bottom, or pick things up. The amount of interaction between the player and the referee, or the game master, and the amount of interaction between the player and the game world both increase considerably, so that now we have a, you know, the gameplay is almost taking on, this conversational gameplay is completely different than what you would typically get in a board game or a war game. And you'll see in these early guys, OD&D and Empire of the Petal Throne, you'll see them having this kind of example of play where they describe this kind of conversational gameplay by just, you know, player says this, you know, game master says that, game master, player, GM. You don't see examples of play in chainmail. You don't see examples of play in most war games or miniature games, except those used to describe a very specific event. Like, here's an example of how, you know, a tank attack against infantry in the woods is resolved. You know, boom, 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 boom. So they're really in these games trying to teach this whole new gameplay. And with this new gameplay was really the final piece to the puzzle of role-playing games, the creation of what we consider role-playing games. We already have the characters. We have the war game methods used to resolve actions. And now we have a conversational gameplay, a lot more back and forth between the player and the referee. And this was hugely popular. And you know, Dave's group pretty much was all dungeons, you know, for the next couple of years. But what you saw too is when they moved out of the dungeon, they moved straight into a hex crawl, or hexes. Now hexes were real common back then among wargamers. So, but you can view the hex as a room. Every hex is a room that has 6 exits. So again, you have a much more limited set of choices for the players, and you have a limited game area that you're trying to manipulate. What this means is the advantage of keeping the game area small and contained and reducing the variables means that the referee can keep a lot of this information, or the game master, in his head. He's not having to consult pages and pages of documents and charts to try and figure out what happens. He can keep the information in his head and respond back very quickly to all the players' actions. You know, if you look at one of the early science fiction games, Traveller has the same sort of method being used. You know, you have those little subsector maps, I think that's what they're called. And, you know, you have your planet, and you have very slow movement. You know, a week of jump, a jump takes a week, and it's up to 6 hexes, although usually won't go nearly that far. So, and every hex that you land in has 1 planet in it. So even if the players are just randomly picking their next stop, the referee can prepare enough stuff for every possible destination that he can be ready no matter what the players do. Now, games that move beyond this sort of physical constraint of the dungeon or the hex map, they need some method in order to keep the players kind of corralled, to kind of limit their options so that they can easily prepare the next adventure. You know, they'll to prepare certain spots or encounters so that for where the players are going to go. Not necessarily just one, but again, limit that number of places they need to prepare. And this is done in one of 2 ways. The first way is what I'll call genre convention, or kind of heroic or superhero method. You know, a superhero by his nature is reactive. You know, if Batman goes on patrol and he doesn't see any crimes, he just goes home and goes to bed, because his actions are dependent on reacting to the crimes being committed. So, and you can control what the players do in like a superhero game by controlling where and when the crimes are committed. So, you know, if the Joker's got the Infinity Gauntlet and is going to use it to destroy Metropolis, well, Spider-Man's got to go stop him. So you can prepare that encounter, you can prepare that secret lair, you know, the Joker's lair, whatever, so that you have something ready for when the players play. This works in like heroic fantasy. So, you know, if the players hear about a vampire who's preying on people at night, you know, they'll go and stop the vampire because that's what heroes do. Or Call of Cthulhu, you have a mythos investigator, so you can see these strange happenings and the players will go to them. So you limit the amount of places that you need to prep for. So this first method is kind of playing on the obligations or duty of the characters. And the second method is more involve the players. And this is what I call in my second edition days is we're going to do the adventure. So you basically get your players to sort of agree beforehand that they're going to play whatever adventure that the game master has prepared. They're going to follow the breadcrumbs and do whatever, you know, whatever it seems that the adventure is supposed to be or where they're supposed to go. So it's more of a meta sort of agreement that the players were all, hey, you know, this is the game we're going to play. We're going to play whatever adventure that's prepared for us. Example of this would be if I'm going to get all my friends together and I say, hey, we're going to play Keep on the Borderlands. Well, the players know that at some point they're going to go to the Caves of Chaos. You know, they're going to go to the keep and ask around and to where the caves are, and then they're going to go to the caves because that's what the adventure is. They're not going to pack up all their stuff and head west down the road right off the map. You know, they're going to explore the map and explore the caves because that's what the adventure is about. So these three methods are that we use to constrain or corral the players into the areas that we've prepared because, you know, we need to keep the adventure in our heads. So either the physical constraints of the dungeon, constraining by the characters' obligations and duties, or just by the players agreeing that they're going to stick to the adventure. Now, nobody uses each of these methods exclusively, generally. We'll have one or the other going on at the same time. And it doesn't mean that either that there's only one thing that the players can do. So even if, you know, in a superhero game, there may be multiple crimes going on and give the players choice which crime to go to, multiple dungeons to explore, or simply, you know, having multiple adventures prepared. So, you know, we're going to stick, you know, another dungeon on the same map so they can kind of pick whichever one they go, or even prepare stuff outside the map. So we can give the players choices, but we need to constrain those choices in order that we can run the game quickly and keep this conversational gameplay going. Now, I know there are people, I've heard legends and rumors of, you know, game masters that can run an adventure completely unscripted, completely off the top of their head, and handle anything the players throw at them, and the players never know they're running through just sort of a, you know, an ad hoc adventure. I can't do that. I've never played with anyone who can do that. If you can do that, it's amazing power, like a gaming superpower. But for the rest of us, for us normal guys trying to run a game, we're going to need to think about what is our dungeon? What are we using to constrain the players' choices? You know, how obvious do we want that to be? How inobvious? So it's something to think about. What is your dungeon? What do you use to constrain the players? And are you doing what, you know, is it really what you want to do? Maybe you can try different things. But anyway, that's about dungeons. And I'll be back with another video next week. Thanks.